Greetings, all. Picking up where we left off last time, today we have the Phoenicians. They're a series of independent city states centered around royal families. They are colonizers, which would be different, but ruled ultimately by an aristocratic elite. They would make Egyptian connections, predominantly through trade. We have papyrus in the city of Byblos, which is Gulba. We have Biblia, the Greek name for book, the origin of the word Bible. They are noted for their production of purple dye, the Phoenikioi, or purple people, the origin of the term Phoenician. They would specialize largely in textiles, glass, and lumber.
Now let's turn to perhaps their greatest contribution, the Phoenician alphabet. Now there were Phoenician colonies and had a very defined cultural influence. We have merchant colonies throughout the Mediterranean. Tyre founded Carthage. Colonial and mercantile influence affected all of the Mediterranean and stimulated the Greeks. The Phoenicians refined the 30-consonant writing system of Ugarit to 22 characters. The Greeks later adopted it.
Quite right, and consider the following. Here we have the evolution of the alphabet, so you can see our general point. This table shows how the shapes of letters changed as the Phoenician alphabet was adopted by the Hebrews, Greeks, and eventually the Romans, from whom, of course, our modern Roman alphabet derives. We mentioned the Phoenicians were colonial. Well, let's have a look at the expanse of their dominion while we are on the subject. Observe Phoenician colonization. Compare this map with the more detailed one of the Hebrew kingdoms. What part of the Mediterranean was the homeland for the Phoenician city-states? Where did Phoenicians establish colonies? Why would overseas colonization be of such crucial importance to the Phoenician city-states? What does their westward colonization imply about the Phoenicians' aims and about the different opportunities available in the Western Mediterranean?
Now, the Phoenicians weren't the only ones to rise from the ashes of the Bronze Age collapse. Let's move on to the Philistines. The reputation is the result of their dominance over their pastoral neighbors, the herdsmen known as the Hebrews. There are no written records. All evidence is archaeological. We know little about their language, but their material culture, behavior, and organization all exhibit close affinities with Mycenaean Greece. They dominated the surrounding countryside by organizing agricultural production and controlling trade routes.
We have to consider the Philistines as a distinct people whose archaeological record is at odds with their depictions in classical sources, namely the Hebrew Bible. We're talking about a series of cities and their surrounding locales that share religion, language, and culture along the coast of the eastern Mediterranean. So, who are they? They are the descendants of the Sea Peoples defeated by Ramses III. The Philistines, they would introduce grapevines and olive trees to the Levant from the Aegean basin. Their prophet would create a very powerful army. Their Pentapolis, or five cities of Gaza, Ascalon, Ashdod on the coast, and the two inland cities of Ekron and Gath, are very similar to Mycenaean citadels, each ruled by a local lord.
Speaking of ancient sources, we cannot proceed without a discussion of the Hebrew people and their scriptures. Hebrew scriptures comprise mythology, laws, and ritual practices, genealogical records, books of prophecy, proverbs, poetry, and royal chronicles. These were known to Christians as the Old Testament. Multiple books composed at different times for different purposes and were only gradually assembled over many centuries.
Hebrews are herdsmen who had just begun to establish permanent settlements around the time of the Philistines' arrival in the Levant. They would organize themselves into 12 tribes, each ruled by a judge who exercised war leadership, the high priesthood, and would settle disputes. The first 5 books are credited to Moses, but there are parallels with Sumerian myths. Think of the creation and also the Great Flood. Archaeological and linguistic evidence suggests that Hebrews are Canaanites. The first 5 books constitute a retrospective history to justify Hebrew traditions and claims of territory. You must think of Hebrew texts as political and cultural justifications. They seek to justify Hebrew conquest of their territory and their right to exist as a distinct people.
Now we see the emergence of a new phenomenon for the Hebrew people, a kingship. Now, Saul was an ineffective war leader. Samuel withdrew his support from Saul and threw it behind David, Saul's son in law. Now, David was successful against Philistines. Remember David and Goliath, while Saul faced defeat. Saul drove David from his court.
Keep in mind the Hebrew tribes were not united and they were vulnerable to the Philistines. Without a strong centralized government, the Hebrew peoples could not stand against the colonial mercantile wealth and the military power that goes with it, and would fall under the sway, hence the poor Phoenician reputation.
Now, David certainly had an uphill battle, but he would consolidate a Hebrew kingdom. David fought as a Philistine mercenary and defeated Saul and then became king. He subsequently defeated the Philistines and confined them to a coastal strip. He defeated the Moabites and the Ammonites. He imposed taxation and forced labor to build a temple to Yahweh at Jerusalem to house the Ark of the Covenant. He encouraged the writing of Hebrew tradition to give them a collective identity.
David's reign, characterized by military success in the expedition of Israel's territory, also faced personal and political challenges. These would include moral failings and familial strife. His relationship with Bathsheba, which would lead to adultery and the arranged death of her husband, exemplifies the complexities of his character and reign. Despite his flaws, David is remembered for his deep religious devotion, culminating in his desire to build a temple to Yahweh, a task ultimately reserved for his son Solomon. We'll get to Solomon. Remember Solomon? He's my favorite.
David's successor, Solomon, would usher in a golden age. Chroniclers display his reign as a golden age, ruled in the style of an ancient Mesopotamian potentate. He instituted oppressive taxation, imposed custom duties, and required subjects to perform forced labor. He constructed a commercial fleet. He maintained a large standing army of unwilling conscripts from his own people. But the levels of oppression were too high, and northern tribes seethed with rebellion. After Solomon's death, the state fragmented into 2 parts.
You must consider Solomon's rule as at the height of splendor. If we believe the Hebrew Bible, which let's look at a single year of the 40 years during Solomon's reign. In this single year, according to Kings 10:14, Solomon collected tribute amounting to 666 talents, some 18,000 kilograms of gold. A golden age indeed. But let's turn again to Kings 4:21, which states, "So Solomon reigned over all the kingdoms from the Euphrates to the land of the Philistines and to the border of Egypt. They brought tribute and served Solomon all the days of his life." This wealth, which he could be criticized for squandering, particularly on his 700 wives and 300 concubines, would be used to build the first temple, which could also be accused of squandering. The first temple, though, a building with three main chambers, five altars, a vast courtyard, and a home for the Ark of the Covenant, we're not getting into any of that mythology here, but understand what this means. Through Solomon's reign, we now have the 10 tribes of Israel in the north with their capital of Shechem, and we have the 2 tribes of Judah with the south capital in Jerusalem. Here's a visual: the Hebrew kingdoms as of 900-ish BCE. Notice the scale of the map and consider the comparatively small size of the Hebrew world. And this is at their golden age, mind you. What advantages did the Philistines and Phoenicians possess, geographical or otherwise? Why did they present such a challenge for the Hebrews? What political and religious consequences might have resulted from the division of the kingdom after the death of Solomon?
Now, you may recall the Assyrian Empire. Well, the Sea Peoples did not fully eliminate them. Now they're back. In the 9th century BCE, they emerged as the Neo-Assyrian Empire, Ashurnasirpal II, between 883 to 859 BCE. He conducted aggressive military campaigns against neighbors. Those that he had defeated had to pay tribute, which gave the Assyrians a reputation for savagery. Now we have Sargon II from 722 to 705 BCE. He extended the frontiers of the Assyrian Empire from western Iran to the Mediterranean, parts of Egypt, defeated the kingdom of Israel in 722 BCE, enslaving and deporting most of the population, and Judah was forced to become a vassal state.
We can think of the Neo Assyrian Empire along 3 lines. It's a military dictatorship which would be bolstered by its army and would use terror to oppress both its enemies and its subjects. Their hereditary monarch was a representative of the god Asher and chief priest. They did operate with an extensive bureaucracy of governors, high priests, and military commanders. Their administrators would exercise local authority on behalf of the king, collecting tribute, recruiting for the army, and administering the law, modeled largely on the Code of Hammurabi. They created an extensive network of roads, mostly for communication, and they're some of the first to aggressively use spies and messengers.
We have the Neo Assyrian Empire, circa 700 BCE. What were the territorial boundaries of the Neo Assyrian Empire? Why would the Assyrians concentrate their efforts in the river valleys and along the coast, neglecting the Syrian interior? Notice the location of the Neo Assyrian capitals of Nineveh and Assur. How was their situation in Mesopotamia likely to affect the Assyrian sense of their own historical identity? Consider the position of Egypt. Why might the Assyrians find it difficult to subjugate Egypt permanently?
There's no nice way to discuss the following: the Neo Assyrians are awful. Assyrians believed that Ashur demanded the constant expansion of his worship through military conquest. They have 2 tenets: the waging of holy war and the exaction of tribute through terror. The Neo Assyrian military machine was a standing army of some 100,000, running primarily off annual plunder, and they would be guilty of savage use of the mutilation of prisoners, systemic rape, as well as mass deportation. They would use iron weapons on a large scale. They would also utilize skirmishers, the first cavalry force, and a corps of engineers for siege warfare.
During this period of Assyrian expansion, consider the following. We have the ritual humiliation of a defeated city's gods. The statues of conquered gods would be removed and worship of Ashur imposed. They were henotheists. They acknowledged other gods, but believed that one god should be the supreme deity of all peoples.
Let's look at some Neo Assyrian atrocities. Judean captives whose city has fallen to the Neo-Assyrian king Sennacherib 704 to 681 BCE are shown being impaled on stakes. This triumphal carving comes from the walls of Sennacherib's palace in Nineveh. What was the purpose of advertising the captives' fates?
Now, Sargon's II successors followed his policy. Sennacherib, between 704 to 681 BCE, rebuilt the city of Nineveh, fortified it with a double wall for a circuit of 9 miles. It contained a large palace and massive aqueducts that carried water for 30 miles from 30 miles away. Ashurbanipal, between 669 to 627 BCE, he rebuilt Babylon. He constructed the library at Nineveh to house cuneiform records. In 627, Neo-Assyrian power seemed at its zenith. Borders were secure, and we have the Hanging Gardens of Babylon.
Here we have Assurbanipal feasting with his wife in a hanging garden. Even this peaceful domestic scene, there's a severed head of the king's recently defeated enemy, the king of Elam. You can see it hanging from a pine tree over there on the left. All this kindness and goodwill, well, it has to come to an end. Being tyrannical, fear mongering, domineering, hegemonic state, they couldn't have any consequences, could it? Why would anyone want them gone? Well, you know, consider climate change and civilization collapse. The Chaldeans would ally with their Indo European Medes, as well as the Neo Assyrian Empire would then be toppled by them, and the Chaldeans would proceed to conquer the kingdom of Judah from 587 to 586 BCE.
And thus, one of the longest lived empires in the world will be born, the Persians. We have Cyrus the Great, 559 BCE. He succeeded to rule a Persian tribe. By 549 BCE, he conquered all of the Persian tribes and challenged the Medes. By 546 BCE, he defeated King Croesus of the Lydians, the first people to use precious metal coinage as a medium of exchange for goods and services. In 539 BCE, he invaded Mesopotamia. He defeated the Chaldeans and allowed the Hebrew captives in Babylon to return home.
In the 6th century BCE, the Persian Empire emerged as the successor state to the Neo Assyrian kings after the region had been ruled for a few decades by the Chaldeans, also the Lydian kingdom. Cyrus allowed the conquered peoples considerable self determination, especially with respect to cultural and religious practices, in contrast to the Assyrians and Chaldeans. His son, Camses II, would conquer Egypt and create the largest empire known to the world at the time. Here's an early Lydian coin, probably struck during the reign of Croesus. This coin was one of many that facilitated long distance trade by making wealth affordable.
Now let's turn our attention to Darius. After Cambyses' death, a brief civil war emerged, and a collateral member of the royal family, Darius, was selected king. He divided the empire into provinces, governed by a satrap. He adhered to Cyrus's policies of toleration. He erected a new royal temple at Persepolis. He expanded the Assyrian road network, had the royal road built, and created an early postal system.
And let's take a moment to discuss the new religion on the block. The Iranian prophet and religious reformer Zarathustra, more widely known as Zoroaster, his Greek name, is traditionally regarded as the founder of this new religion, Zoroastrianism, which contains both monotheistic and dualistic features. It's likely influenced the other major religions, which is why we're talking about it here, namely Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and we'll be returning to those later.
This is a cylinder seal of Darius the Great. 522 to 486 BCE. Seals were used in place of signatures to authenticate documents and correspondence. The cylindrical matrix on the right was rolled in soft wax to create an impression. This finely wrought example shows the king in a chariot, hunting lions with a bow. A winged representation of the god Ahura Mazda rises above the scene.
Persians would begin to consolidate their rule. The conquest of Lydia would bring Greek speaking peoples in Ionia under their rule. From 499 to 494, those communities would rebel against the Persian rule. Darius would defeat them, and his forces would be met with defeat by the hands of the Greeks at the mainland in Marathon 490. His son Xerxes would attempt to avenge this humiliation by invading Greece in 480. Greece would provide a western buffer to Persian expansion. And we'll come back to the Greeks, don't you worry.
Now, the legacy of Zoroastrianism, still prominent today, was important as well. Founded by Zarathustra, Zoroaster, a Persian who probably lived shortly before 600 BCE and sought to reform the traditional customs of the Persian tribes. Zarathustra taught that Ahura Mazda was more powerful, but later priests, the Magi, emphasized their duality, engaged in an internal struggle for supremacy. Zoroastrianism helps explain Persian tolerance.
Ah, yes, Zarathustra, my favorite Nietzschean character. One whom everyone quotes, but so few understand. Anyway, let's move on to this map. The Persian Empire under Darius I, 521 to 486 BCE. Consider the location of the Persian heartland and the four administrative centers of Persepolis, Susa, Ecbatana, and Sardis. What older kingdoms and empires did the Persian Empire contain? How did Darius I successfully rule such large and complex empires?
Now let's return to the Hebrew people. There's a new god on the block, monolatry, exalting one god, denying the existence of others. We have the Levites, who use literacy to promote the ascendancy of Yahweh. We have the Levites bolstering the political supremacy of David's dynasty and the city of Jerusalem.
Now, we have to separate monolatry from monotheism, the belief in a single God, the creator and ruler of all things, associated with predominantly the Hebrews and Yahweh. Early Hebrews are polytheistic. They worshiped nature spirits such as Azazel and the Canaanite deity El. Hebrew theology would begin to evolve. One Yahwehist, Jeremiah 637 to 587, would rail against foreign cults and warned of disastrous consequences. Yahweh would become transcendent, not a part of nature, but the very creator of it. We have to consider Yahweh abstractly, separate from the operation of the natural world. He appointed humans to be the rulers of nature by divine mandate, and the Hebrew people would articulate universal ethics, a universal theory of justice and righteousness.
Whether cause or symptom, there would be some political fragmentation too. After Solomon's death, regional distinctions arose within Yahweh's cult. The rulers of the northern kingdom of Israel discouraged activities in Jerusalem. Sargon II absorbed that kingdom as a province and enslaved nearly 28,000 Hebrews. The southern kingdom of Judah survived, but collaboration with the Neo-Assyrians meant acceptance of the god Assur. The prophet's insistence that Yahweh alone could be exalted was a reaction to the aggressive promotion of Assur by the Neo-Assyrians.
Prophets Amos and Hosea preached in Israel before it fell to the Neo-Assyrians in 722. Prophets Isaiah and Jeremiah would preach in Judah before its fall in 586. Notice a pattern? Ezekiel and the second Isaiah would preach in Babylon when the Hebrews were there. and before its fall.
Now, Judaism takes shape. The three core principles of the prophets: Yahweh is the only God. Yahweh is the source of all righteousness. Evil comes from humanity. Yahweh demands ethical behavior.
The Chaldeans under Nebuchadnezzar would then conquer Jerusalem, destroy its temple, carry thousands of Hebrews off to Babylon, 587 to 86, as we mentioned. These same Yahwehists would be allowed in Jerusalem to survive under Neo-Assyrian domination. The king Josiah of Judah, 621 to 609, consider him as a monotheist, employing prophets throughout his court. He had the law of Moses redrafted to bring it into line with more current policies. Think of it as an update. The book of Deuteronomy was quote unquote discovered and hailed as Moses' second law.
This is the goddess Asherah. The Canaanite fertility goddess Asherah was the wife of the god Baal, or his father El, but she also figures in some inscriptions as the wife of the Hebrew god Yahweh. One Hebrew king placed an image of her in the temple of Yahweh at Jerusalem. Why might this be viewed as controversial then or now?
Speaking of controversial things, here's the reconstruction of the Ishtar Gate. This is a reconstruction of one of the 50-foot high entrance gates built into the walls of Babylon by King Nebuchadnezzar around 575. About half of this is reconstruction. What might be so controversial is that it's currently in the Pergamon Museum in Berlin.
Now, we can't finish without some discussion of the Babylonian captivity. The patriotic Yahwists defined Hebrew identity during the captivity as Yahweh existed outside of nature. Hebrews could exist without a state. Judaism survived with no political power to back it and no holy places to ground it. Now, after Cyrus allowed the Jews to return, Jerusalem and the temple were rebuilt. But many stayed in Persia and others were long settled in Egypt. A new generation of Jews post captivity applied a strict interpretation of the Torah.
This new generation of Jews, these post captivity Jews, would apply this strict interpretation, and from this monotheism would emerge a common worldview of all Western civilization. And that is why these little people in a little corner of the world who play such a small role at the time of their existence will become so very important later on. But that's a story for another day. Until then, like, share, subscribe, take it easy.